Service Fabric community Q&A.
All right, and we're rolling. All right. So, for those of you who have been around for a while, you know how this goes. Typically, people, dump questions in the chat window, or you're free to unmute and chat as well. In the absence of questions, you usually get to hear me ramble about whatever we've been up to lately. So, it's in your control exactly what we get to talk about. I think while people are figuring out their questions, we can talk a little bit about what we've been up to lately. There's been a couple updates that have been rolling out to Service Fabric. You might have seen those if your clusters are... Oh, no, wait, automatic still might be paused until 7.1. As a reminder, we paused automatic updates when the COVID crisis kicked off, just to give people a little more control over their environments. People might not be paying 100% as much attention to their environments as they did previously, and we didn't want to cause any unexpected chaos. So we make the releases available, but getting them upgraded in your environment is kind of up to you. So there was an update to 7.0, the sixth refresh there. A couple minor bug fixes, nothing super major. And then the next release for 7.1 should be rolling out starting soon. If it hasn't started already, I'd have to go check. And then with 7.0 with 7.1 CU1, or the refresh there, we do expect that we will be re-enabling automatic updates. So that's something that folks should watch for. If you don't want automatic updates in your environment, you can look up the instructions for setting your cluster version 2 manual, and then you get control over when and how it moves. And it's always kind of a toss-up for a lot of folks. We say, leaving everything on automatic is good. On the other hand, since you don't have full control over when the updates actually take effect in a given region, we have seen people want to leave their production environments on manual, so that they, the automatic updates come and they hit, your test or integration environments. And then once you've had a chance to validate that everything looks good there, you can go to your production environments and move it to manual and move it up to the latest version. That's a pretty common pattern as well. Since we've heard a lot of feedback about that, just to let everyone know, one of the things we're talking about in the future is some sort of wave selection. So what this would be additional configuration on your clusters that said, I want this cluster to be the first one that gets updated, or the second one that gets updated, or the third one that gets updated. And so if you had, development, integration, and prod environments in a given region, you might set your development cluster to automatic wave 1, your integration environment to automatic wave 2, and your production environment to automatic wave 3. And what that would do is that when the update first lands in the region, we would go and immediately update all of the wave 1 clusters. And then we'd wait a little while, maybe a week or something. We're still kind of working out the recommendation. So if you have feedback on this, please do let us know. But we do wave 1, wave 2, and then wave 3. And this would give you some sort of staging so that your choice wasn't entirely binary, automatic or manual, right? It would be automatic with a certain cadence in a certain order, right? And that way you get a chance to flesh out any issues that you might encounter in kind of a planned way, rather than having to go to a bunch of manual operations. So just awareness, that's something that we're looking into, and that's coming. I don't think we'll get it in this semester, so not by June, but probably by, I hope, the end of the calendar year. So that's that. That's what's rolling out right now. As always, you can go to the tech community site and see releases and announcements. With each release, we do have release notes. We are also still working on getting those release notes to be better, so that they tell you more information about what is actually changing.
Matt, on that update, Peter Hunter said that he loves the wave update feature. Sounds like there's some excitement for that. He'd like to see being able to specify a time and day of the week for the upgrade to happen as well.
Yeah, that's something that we're thinking about maybe as the thing that comes after the waves. So you get an order, and then we can start to do timing as well. We haven't considered that. That won't be a part of the wave thing at first, I don't think. But it is something we know is a request and something that we're looking into. I also see that there's some questions in the chat now. Let me see if I can parse these and start getting you some answers.
Yeah, it looks like Juho has a couple of questions.
Yeah. So are volatile collections essentially identical to reliable collections, but the state is not persisted to disk? Yes, that's the idea. The state is still replicated, yes. So you effectively you're only using RAM to ensure that the data is HA. If so, how would one choose between the volatile and non-volatile reliable collections? Isn't the temp disk essentially volatile? Well, it's still a persisted disk. So if the VM reboots, the temp disk is still there. So it's volatile in the sense that it is unstable. Azure doesn't guarantee that it survives all VM maintenance operations, for example. So there are cases in Azure where Azure will shut down your VM and move it somewhere else. And in those cases, the temp drive doesn't move with you. So you lose it in those cases. But if your process blinks or if the VM restarts, the temp disk is still there. In this case, because we're not using the temp disk or any disk, then the data goes away, right? And so you're really just relying on the fact that you have some number of replicas up and running in order to keep the data, safe. So the choice between volatile and non-volatile is really about safety, right? Is this data that you feel comfortable losing, or are you comfortable getting into quorum loss more often? If you're not, right, then I wouldn't consider the volatile collections to be, or the in-memory collections to be a good choice. It's not really about RAM capacity usually, because by default, the collections are going to try to keep everything in memory in either case. It's just that in the persisted case, there's an option if RAM starts to get full that it can flush the least recently used stuff values, specifically, not keys today, but the least recently used values can get flushed out to disk so that they are only on disk. So in that case, the total size of the collection can exceed the size of memory. Whereas in the in-memory collections, that's not an option, right? You're specifically telling us don't overflow and don't put things on disk. So it's kind of a safety performance trade-off, where if you want the safety, then you go with persisted. If you really need the performance, where touching disk is proven to be, the bottleneck for some reason with SSDs, that's kind of hard. With traditional spinning media, it was a little easier to find that to be a bottleneck. But if that's the bottleneck, or if you didn't want to pay to have larger disks and you were okay having a lot of RAM instead, then you could select the in-memory collections and go that way. So hopefully that explains some of the differences. If there's more differences you want to discuss, just drop another question. The question around Ephemeral OS. Price. Yep. Is there a way to somehow use Ephemeral OS disks and still have better price per gigabyte for reliable collections? Not really. Unfortunately, this is just kind of how Azure has decided to price the hardware options and some of these different, and deliver some of these different VM features. So we've talked with them before about different VM SKUs that might prioritize local storage. So for example, I think it's the M series. I'd have to go look again, but there is a series that does kind of prioritize local storage. But yeah, the whole point of the Ephemeral OS disk is that it's really an argument about availability trade-offs. So today, one of the things that people see is that if Azure Storage does, have an issue in a region, one of the things that you'll see in your VMs is that eventually they shut down because the operating system disk is backed by storage. So if the operating system is trying to read and write things to the operating system drive, or Service Fabric is trying to read and write things to the operating system drive, eventually the VM kind of freaks out because it can't go and make those changes back into storage. And the Ephemeral OS drive alleviates that concern. And as a result, because it's guaranteed that it's only talking to the local OS, the local physical hardware, you also get a bunch of performance improvements. So that's just kind of how they've chosen to deliver the feature, and they have tied it to these premium storage SKUs. So I guess, the answer becomes try and keep less stuff in the collections, or really only keep the super hot mutable data that you need live in the collections, and put other things in other storage places, right? So maybe, Cosmos DB or SQL, some store. I know Cosmos DB can also be quite expensive, but you really end up with this kind of tiered storage thing where only the super hottest mutable stuff lives in the collections, and anything that's cold, you kind of want to flush out to something else that's going to be cheaper and easier to run. So yeah, that's just kind of the state of the world with Ephemeral OS disks, and hopefully in the future, maybe the support for Ephemeral OS disks will expand to different VM SKUs, or we'll get better VM SKUs that allow you to take more advantage of the collections, right? As it is today, I still tell people that generally, when it comes to storing data in the collection, sure, you can store tons of data in the collections, and it's perfectly reasonable to do so. However, if you find yourself starting to pay compute VM prices, right, to store cold data, then there's probably an issue or a mistake somewhere. Some workloads really do need that, right? You really need the hot data so that at any moment you could go read it and it's right there at disk, and your read latencies are in the milliseconds. So, like single digit milliseconds. But if you don't have that requirement, then paying compute VM prices for cold storage is going to be really, really expensive. Even if that's, the RAM price versus the data disk price. So I would say evaluate, what data and you're keeping in the collections. I would evaluate the size of that data. Maybe the default serializer in the collections is net data contract serializer. We know that isn't the most efficient serializer known to man. So, if you wanted to swap out serializers for, say, protobuf or something else that serialized your data to something more compact, and you got disk size or memory size savings that way, or garbage collection size savings that way, those are all reasonable things that we've seen people do to try and reduce their on-disk footprint and make some of these VM sizes more practical. But that's kind of the best we can offer at this point. Moving on. Let's see. Great, thanks. Okay, good explanation. Good, thanks. Sorry, I saw some additional things pop up. I wasn't sure if I was missing more questions. Hopefully that answered the question and kind of gave you a sense of where the different options lay. If you haven't looked in the custom serialization, if you're still just using the default serializer, particularly if you have complex types or nested types, then I have seen data contract serializer get awfully heavy with regard to the size of the data, serialized size of the data versus the deserialized side of the data. So that's something you might want to look into, is just to profile that and see if it's a problem. Okay, we do have more questions. Good.
Yeah.
Partitioning hot cold questions. What CI platforms do we see customers using? I see Azure DevOps. I've seen some people start to get started with GitHub Actions, doing custom stuff there. I've seen Circle CI. I've seen Octopus. Octopus isn't, I don't know if people really consider that a CI system, but I've seen a lot of these. I feel like there's another one that somebody got in touch with. I have seen Jenkins. In fact, there was a Jenkins plugin for SF that existed for a while. I don't know whether that's still maintained by whoever built that. But a bunch, a diversity.
I guess the follow-up on that is, since we're currently using DevOps,
Mhm.
have there been any complaints of those builds taking an extraordinarily long time? And largely, I'm just seeing it that right now I'm in the middle of a long-running support ticket on it that it seems to just come down to, they think it's just because there's such large assemblies. It's just a big file, and thus it's slow for some reason.
Which assemblies?
Just it zips up everything in in the application package. It just so I've got just the my entire application comes out to about 3 gigs. They say, oh, that's a big file. That's just going to take a very long time. But anyway, it's
I haven't seen that generally, but I also haven't seen too many single applications that large.
okay.
So that might be part of it. One thing, I don't know whether or not in DevOps, I know that they have compress. I also know that they have the differential packaging.
Sure.
You might see whether or not those work. I also know that there was a bug with the differential packaging where it was always differential because the zip file gets created with a different kind of header checksum every single time. So it was always 100% different, even though it shouldn't be.
Okay.
Those things exist. So the differential packaging, especially, I would look into making sure you're using. It's not repeatable builds. What's the name of the flag inside the compiler?
I know what you're talking about. Yeah.
It's like consistent builds, right? So that if you haven't changed the code doesn't you don't regen it.
Yeah.
That'll help the differential packaging pick up only the changes that you've actually made. The assemblies you've actually touched.
Yeah.
Is this
the deterministic one, right?
Deterministic build. That's it. That's the one. So is it all one code package or is it a bunch of separate?
It's 37 services.
37 services. Yeah, I mean, the differential packaging is really the only thing that I think can save you there. So that say only one of the services is the one that changed. That should be the only thing in that package.
Sure.
Now,
I mean, unfortunately, the problem we've had with that is while there is a build step that tackles that, it has to download the entire last build, which again, just I don't know, it's just something with DevOps. I think is that it's just slowest time to download stuff from them. So it has to download the entire package, and the processing of it is blazing fast. If we're seeing that each of our builds takes 1 hour to do, but 45 minutes of that is just upload and download from DevOps.
Yeah, that seems strange.
Yeah, that's what I thought. But
yeah, I haven't heard of that as a general problem, and I'd say we're most exposed to Azure DevOps.
Okay.
So I would continue on that support ticket, and my bet is that it's going to come down to something about they do something weird for the agents where either they're throttled or it's a multi-tenant system, so they just slice off a tiny part of the network for each one. That's going to be my bet. You could also try. I think that there are options to host your hosted agents either in your own pool or on-prem somewhere. Yeah. I would maybe compare it, see if you can get a build through one of those other options and see if it makes a difference.
Okay.
That will, kind of give you a hint as to whether or not it's the default shared pool or whether it's something in the, kind of DevOps pipeline code itself.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. Thanks.
Okay. Compose has been in preview for a while. Yeah, we don't know if we're going to GA that thing. Compose keeps going in and out of favor in the community. And so every single time we've thought we were going to GA it, something strange happens to the Docker community. Like the last time it was that Docker itself got split into the enterprise support and the kind of more developer focused story. And so we were here like, well, and the community wasn't terribly bought off on Compose as a format, but then they open source Compose and put it under governance. And so now we need to figure out if that's something we want to leverage. Also, we kind of built Compose wrong. The support for it was built kind of directly into the runtime, and what it should have been was more of a translation layer that lived outside that would, take a Compose and convert it into an application manifest, but instead we built it kind of directly in the runtime. So it's hard to evolve. So we're still trying to figure out what to do with the support for Compose overall. Use of Docker containers is GA'd forever. So even though Compose is in preview, it's really just about that translation from Compose into an application and doing the deployments via Compose. That's the part that's in preview. Everything else, container-wise, is GA'd.
Yeah, great.
Application insights. Well, it's funny that they say they're in a Kubernetes direction. That might be for public, like third-party consumption, but like they have to do work for us because we run kind of the core of Azure, and lots of people use application insights. So
yeah, that's kind of what I said.
yeah, we see this a lot in when these conferences and QA happen, is that maybe the people who are out there are very focused on, whatever the current, product or message or hotness is, and they don't know about work going on. I know that we have work slated for improving integration with them in the following semester. So
Okay.
Microsoft follows these 6-month semesters, so we're getting done with one now. They didn't do a lot of work for us in the last semester, but we have work scheduled for them for the next semester, and we're negotiating, who does it and what work goes on. But it's always one of those things that's got to get better. And while I'm sure that they have to go do a bunch of work in order to support Kube and AKS and things like that, because those services are very popular right now, and they're starting from nothing. That doesn't mean that there's not work going on that's SF related. I would surprise if that's
they haven't abandoned Service Fabric
then. No, because they can't.
Informed. Okay.
So that would it's probably just a messaging and communication thing. I wouldn't worry about it too much.
Right.
One thing that we run into with application insights in particular, it might just be because of how constantly their SDK evolves. They've been known to introduce breaking changes, and then especially the ASP.NET Core team, I think they changed their hosting model about every 6 months for what your program and startup files look like. So we had a horrible time last August and September trying to get a working configuration of Service Fabric on Linux with .NET Core 2.1 previews and application insights. And I'm sure it hasn't gotten much better since then, but that's probably some of it is just keeping up with the SDKs.
Yeah, I mean, we've heard that as feedback from both the monitoring side of things, where in the last year and a half, it was OMS and App Insights, and then log analytics and what's next, right? So that churn through those separate products has been confusing for a lot of people and hard to figure out what goes where. Those stories are finally starting to converge. So I'm hoping that now with log analytics that will stabilize and standardize. Right. And then we can kind of jump, right? We can kind of just snap to something that's going to be the standard for a while.
That would be good. Yeah, especially like a known, I remember maybe a year and a half ago, I saw something come out about an OMS template or something for Service Fabric clusters running Windows and Azure. And it was like, okay, do this plus App Insights for your client, like application code, and you've got all the monitoring you want. That's kind of disappeared. And then especially with popularity of Linux due to pricing, like there's no good equivalent for that. So really looking forward to seeing something around that.
Yeah, and we are as well. This is a pain point for everybody. It's for both the monitoring side of things and the other projects that we touch. So what we sometimes find, as you pointed out, is that there might be a solution on Windows for .NET Full Framework and on .NET Core for Linux, but if you try and swap, either of those, you end up in a no man's land for some reason.
Yep. Exactly.
So the matrix of options has these islands of stability. And if you land on one of these spots that's sparse, where there's nothing filled in, then it can be very hard to figure out what to do. And you're not the only ones in that boat. We internally are in that boat for some of the things that we build. So I think it's good that we keep up, kind of pressure on some of these partner teams so we can ask, hey, give us a standard solution that's going to work kind of across all these different, vertices, so that no matter where I land, there's a standard supported option that works for, here's my cluster level, here's my infrastructure level stuff, here's my cluster level stuff, that's Service Fabric's problem, and then here's my application level story, right? You kind of want all three of these to be going to the same place and following the same pattern. And what we keep seeing, especially longer ago when these were kind of 3 separate products, is that it was very hard to get a consistent answer out of that, right? One part would be log analytics, one part would be app insights, one part would be OMS, and your brain explodes. And so I think that's finally starting to stabilize, and we're working with those teams to get a better story.
Right.
Isn't OpenTelemetry a solution to that?
It is. If I can get a standard implementation of that for all these things in Azure, that would be great. I mean, this is one of these reasons.
That's the plan, right?
Yeah, it shouldn't. Look, from SF's perspective, there's a reason we've been writing to ETW since the beginning of time, right? And that's because that's the one consistent thing that has existed and been stable, right? And then we you know, and it's a disservice to you, the customer, but you can understand because we're in the same boat you are. We kind of put up our hands and say, whatever Azure's monitoring story is, that's what you should go do. And the problem is that that story hasn't been stable for more than a year or two for the history of SF. And so you get a lot of recommendations and docs and templates and samples that change, right? So if you go search back, right, you find snippets, right, that don't apply anymore. And so we're really trying to work with the monitoring folks in hopes that they can get us a standard story that's going to work on Windows, Linux, .NET Core, .NET Full Framework, containers, not containers, right? Things that use the SDK, things that don't use the SDK. And we're really hoping that there's can be kind of one simple solution for you, the customer, that we
internal and external customers as well, right?
Yeah, it's the same problem. I mean, like we're not doing anything terribly different internally, and lots of people have the same problems. So it's gotta converge, is all I'm saying. And I know that that's a thing that they are working towards, right?
I did post a diagram in the chat that should help alleviate this problem once and for all. So
it's very accurate. Thank you, Lars.
My pleasure.
There was a quick question here about Getups in SFRP or SF. We haven't looked at that yet. What we're looking for right now and what we're investigating next will be GitHub Actions specifically, and how that interacts with DevOps. We have a bunch of work with our, so again, this is kind of a partner team that sits outside of SF, but for the DevOps teams and GitHub Actions teams, you know, what integration there looks like, how do we get that planned, how do we, you know, tell the story about the differences between these two things. That's, again, something that we have to do generally because people have to go understand when to use which. But that's something that we're looking into. We have not looked into GitOps at this time specifically. Let's see, Lars. Okay. Lars asked a question about mesh, and I'll answer the question about mesh.
I'm sorry, I have muted myself, and I wanted to address the Getups thing. I'm sorry for that.
That's okay. Do that.
So regarding the Getups thing, to me, I think that it would be extremely easy to implement Getups approach in Service Fabric specifically because you already download the manifest from storage accounts using the way that SFRP is currently designed and the application model. So it looks like a very easy to implement.
Yeah, it should.
And and GitOps is getting now a lot of traction. So maybe it will be better to start with GitOps, which is now being cool.
Yeah, above my pay grade, but we're looking at all of them, right? I mean, it's something that we know we are going to need to deal with, especially as the GitOps, GitHub Actions, and DevOps story converge, right? Again, we're going through something similar to what we went through with monitoring, where there's 3 or 4 different product offerings from Microsoft, and you get the sense that they've got to converge or at least come up with some consistent story across them. And we're we want to be participating in that story, right? But we're trying not to go sink a bunch of energy into either actions or ops or DevOps just to have the story change from underneath us. So trying to work through with those partners what their story is and figure out what we snap to. Okay, so the story on mesh. So mesh comes up about every community call or every other community call. So don't worry about it.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I wasn't at the last one.
It's okay. So I'll say, and if you know, I don't mean to say follow me on Twitter, but if you do follow me on Twitter, you'll also see me answer this question on Twitter probably once a week, where I should really write it down once and then link to it. That's a smart idea. I should do that. But the short answer is that it is unlikely at this time that mesh in its current form is going to GA. And so the reasoning behind that is that we got feedback that, well, this is good, but I'm interested in running things that don't run in a Service Fabric environment. And also, this is good, but it doesn't help me actually describe my whole application. My whole application is not just the long-running workload that run in SF. I've got logic apps. I've got Azure websites. I've got some of the new static pages. I've got a SQL database, right? And those things are a part of my application, but they are not modeled here. So what do? I'm really just stuck back in ARM land. And so the evolution of mesh mesh was two things, right? It was an application model and an environment. So the environment we shaved off, and if you go look at like build talks last year or Rusinovich's data center futures talk in particular, you'll see that there's this big Service Fabric environment called Atlas that's sitting down underneath a bunch of stuff, right? So that's basically the evolution of the mesh environment. We need to solve this problem generically, so we're building, you know, big Service Fabric environments and then running all sorts of things on top of them. So functions and ACI are first, and we'll see what comes after that. More things might just use ACI and functions. So we don't know how many things are going to need to talk to that environment directly. The application model evolved into what is now OM. If you haven't heard of OM, I think it's om.dev, OAM.dev. And that is the open application model. There's also a standardization effort going on right now with a thing called Crossplane. So these are ideas that let you describe, hey, here's my application. It's got queues and databases and my long-running code and my short-running code and my static web pages, and that's my application. And you wanted that application description to be environment agnostic, so I could, you know, pick it up and give it to Azure, and Azure would presumably do something smart and PaaS-y with it. But I could also pick it up and go run it on-prem on Kubernetes, because everyone has a Kubernetes cluster on-prem and they want to use that as their development environment. So you get this application description portability, and you get to move things around. The next question is, how does that application model converge, diverge at a different layer regarding ARM, right? So there's a separate team who's trying to figure out the future of this generic application model, how it wraps around and how it describes all the different parts of your application, and then figure out where you want to host it. And if one of those places is Azure, right, well, for the long running stuff, it probably ends up down in that Atlas environment or running on Service Fabric somewhere. Or, you know, you've taken a dependency on particularly a Service Fabric part, so it needs to run on Service Fabric in some way. Or it's, you know, a database, and so it goes and runs over in Azure SQL. But really, that's what we learned from that application model part. Another thing that we learned is that people really wanted Service Fabric, but with a lot of the management parts taken away, right? Because managing all that Azure infrastructure is hard. So what we've been working on, and you'll start to see parts of this pop out, is two things. We talk about them in two ways. One is we talk about running the system services as a service, so you don't have them in your cluster, and therefore managing your cluster gets easier. And then the other part we've talked about is really encapsulating a lot of those Azure resources, so your networks and your VM SKUs and all this stuff, to make it easier to manage. So, you know, instead of doing, you know, an example that I give that isn't going to be live anytime soon, but which helps think about the problem, is certificate rotation. Everybody loves certificate rotation, right? And no one's ever broken their cluster rotating their cert. Raise your hand if you've broken your cluster rotating your cert. I have broken clusters rotating my cert, right? So, wouldn't it be nice if cert rotation was just automated, right? So you put your keys in Key Vault, and then the right things automatically happen, right? Or, changing your VM SKU, right? Changing your VM SKU is this script that we give you that says, here's these 12 steps that apply to about 50% of clusters most of the time, right? Take this script or something like it and go do these 12 things to your environment in order to change your SKU in the safe supported way, right? And of course, no one's ever followed those instructions correctly, right? Everyone reads about the first half or executes them in an arbitrary order or something, right? And things go wrong. So what if these types of management changes to the infrastructure were automated, right? So that's kind of the encapsulation thing. So you still get to choose, your network and your VM SKUs and your VNets and how all these things are configured. But when you need to change them, then that change is automated and kind of done in a best practices way out of your control, right? That has been a source. Those sorts of infrastructure changes have been one of the largest sources of incidents that we've seen on Service Fabric. Somewhere between 30 and 60% of the incidents we get are related to manipulating the infrastructure and having things go bad. And we didn't see those sorts of incidents on Mesh, right? Because that sort of infrastructure level control wasn't exposed, right? So how do we give people some more flexibility in terms of Mesh had limited sizes, limited runtimes, all sorts of things were fairly cut down and scoped. How do we give people back some of the control over their environment, but also avoid a lot of the incidents that we saw or a lot of the problems that we saw when we did more of this work on your behalf, right? So we're taking some of the learnings we got from Mesh and we're kind of rolling that into the core product, right? And so that works ongoing. You probably haven't noticed it, but there's a few things that we've already automated and simplified. So there are things that you can't do in your Service Fabric clusters now that were never going to be allowed, that were always bad ideas, that have already been removed, right? And we've seen incidents related to those types of manipulations already go to zero, as we would expect, because we banned some unsafe operation. So that sort of direction is going to continue, and we're going to try and figure out a sweet spot between letting you customize stuff but also automating and hiding as much of the infrastructure management as possible to really make Service Fabric clusters easier to run, right? That's kind of one of the things that people got out of Mesh that we're going to preserve, right? And the good thing about doing it this way, right, is not only do you get Service Fabric clusters that are easier to run, but you do still have access to the full Service Fabric runtime, right? You don't have to wait for us to go figure out how to expose all of the SDKs and everything up into this Mesh environment, right? You get to use the runtime like you use it today, right? And so that helps bring people forward while taking some of the management of the infrastructure away, which was the big thing that we heard about. On the other hand, just again, things we're learning from Mesh as we're kind of figuring out what the interesting ideas were. People liked Service Fabric's programming models, right? And when we moved them to this serverless environment, the programming models weren't there, right? The hosting model is just you handed Mesh a set of containers, right? And people said, well, but I liked the programming models, or I thought the programming models were useful to help me figure out, how to solve some of these common problems. And we see that problem persisting in these serverless environments, right? So even if we get to serverless Kubernetes or serverless Service Fabric or applications that don't really fit in logic apps or functions or app services, people kind of want that SDK, or at least need some of that SDK's capabilities in order to write their app well. And so that's kind of what the spark of the Dapper project. If you haven't heard of Dapper, there's a bunch of sessions at Build, I think, in the last couple of days about Dapper. I encourage you to go check them out. But what Dapper is an attempt to take some of the programming model ideas that we had in SF and fully abstract them from the running environment. So Dapper doesn't care where it's running, and you get things like basic support for messaging, you get basic pub sub, you get basic actors, you get discovery, right? Now Dapper really is kind of a shim in a lot of ways. It's abstract from the environment because it expects the environment to be providing a lot of these capabilities. So you might think of it as an SDK, but it really is a giant plugin model, right? And the idea is that if you needed something like Service Fabric stateful services or reliable collections, you could bind directly to the Service Fabric SDK, no problem there. But then you're really bound to SF. And some people found that to be, they didn't like it. They felt it was too sticky. And so, again, learning from Mesh and hearing some of that feedback, we said, okay, what if the SDK you actually targeted was environment independent, but then when you ran your code in a particular environment, all of these, things got hooked up, right? And we see that being, a decent pattern that is probably going to continue to persist in a serverless environment going forward. So again, that's the long version of what's the deal with Mesh, what's up, what's happening, and what's likely to happen. So we're taking what we've learned from the Mesh project, right? We're kind of taking all the interesting parts apart and either spinning them into, good separate projects that help address concerns, or good learnings on the Service Fabric or other environment sides in Azure to try and make, application development easier, right? And so, I'm hoping that in the future, right, you have an application model that describes your app in your terms. It says, I need a cache, I need some Kafka messaging, I need, or eventing, I need this long running work, I have this static website. And you kind of want to be able to hand that to Azure and have Azure host all of those components in a serverless way in the environment that makes the most sense, right? So the website isn't going to live, on Service Fabric raw directly, right? It still makes sense that would be Azure websites, right? And a lot of these things at the end of the day are going to be running on SF down at the metal somewhere, right? But you don't necessarily need to be exposed to all that infrastructure, even if you've taken a direct dependency on Service Fabric, right? So there's a lot of things that we learned from Mesh. I think we actually got a lot of value out of building it and then, getting this feedback. But the core of it needed to be bigger, right? It needed to be a bigger concept. And so a lot of these things are now these bigger concepts. I was long-winded, but I hope it helps.
This is very helpful. My headphones cut out when you were describing the Atlas piece, but I can go back and listen to that.
Yeah, I would go back and look at, I think it was either Build or Ignite last year, Mark Racinovich's Data Center Futures talk. It's described briefly there. I think it was.
Yeah, I watched that talk. So I vaguely remember, the kind of basically having a large cluster that's available for spinning up things like functions or AKS or whatever as an underpinning. You were saying something right when my headphones cut out about that potentially folding back to Service Fabric in the future.
Well, what we're saying is that regardless of whether or not an environment runs, that environment exists and it's going to continue to exist and get bigger.
Right.
All we were saying is that we're taking some of the learnings about what Mesh had in terms of an infrastructureless attempt at Service Fabric's capabilities,
right.
And we're going to be doing some of that management work to try and give you a full Service Fabric environment without exposing all of it to you.
Yep, sounds good. And I like Marcin's suggestion about the hosted primary node pool. So
yeah, that's another thing where we want to take that out and run it as a service. There's going to be some pros and cons to that. It might not be appropriate for all workloads, but in Azure, it's certainly something that we can do to make life easier.
Yeah.
Okay. So
thank you.
Lots of other questions.
Yeah, Matt, a few times it's come up. There's no specific build session from this week that you would point to specifically on Service Fabric. Is that correct?
No, I'd have to go look to see if Racinovich's Data Centers Future talk even made it for build. I don't think it did. So like build this year is incredibly condensed. All sorts of things aren't in there. So I wouldn't use existence of an SF talk in build or not in build. My running gag with a buddy of mine who also works on some infrastructure stuff in Azure is, when somebody says, hey, I didn't see any demos for your stuff in build this year, we say, what do you mean all of them were demos of our stuff? So if you scratch a lot of these services, you find Service Fabric under the hood. Even if we're not talking about Service Fabric as a top level thing, it's still there, it's still supported. We do these community calls, we roll out releases regularly. I encourage you to stay in touch with us, either through Twitter or GitHub, these calls, ping me. Our emails are open. We know that there's a lot of folks out there, and that the lack of a big marquee headline can be stressful sometimes, but it doesn't have a lot to do, especially this year, with the importance of the criticality or plans or anything like that. It's really just we had a limited amount of time to throw together a virtual build, and I think they've actually been doing a really good job of it. But all sorts of things out there. So get in touch and ask questions. In the meantime, go back and watch all the old build talks we gave. They're all still great, and they're all still relevant. So Marcin, what needs to happen before we get LCOW or WSL2? Yeah, this is really not in control of the SF team. This is up to a lot of things from the cosine/Windows org about how they want to support Linux containers on Windows. So even between how WSL1 and WSL2 works, that you can see that there's been massive changes, and I think they're still trying to figure out that story. So I don't have any news or any information about when or specifically that's going to land, but I can say that is a continued request that we see. If you have need of this stuff, I know Juho and a few other folks have been pinging GitHub. I would just continue to do that, and also feel free to send me mail and say, hey, I have these scenarios. I want to do this on-prem, or I want to do this with LCOW in Azure. How do I make this happen? Again, I think a lot of this has been an evolving conversation, particularly around the status of Docker Incorporated, and the integration and partnership between Docker Incorporated and Microsoft, right? And so unfortunately, I'm not in charge of how some of these decisions get made. But we do continue to hear a desire to get that to work. I don't know how to make it work today. But that is something that we kind of want to address. Can we somehow join containers to a VNet using Swift networking, or is it something reserved for first party? What's Swift networking? That's something, again, that's kind of tied into how do we want to support this stuff in Azure going forward. It is stuff that we're lighting up first for some of these managed scenarios like ACI. For how to do it in your own environments, it's not really doable today. You can technically, if you read the description of HNS in Windows, you might be able to glue some stuff together with Docker EE and HNS, but it's really, really difficult, and it's not fully supported today. So that's something that, again, we're trying to figure out how to extend and support so that it becomes, more standard.
I have went through the code of Azure CNI and this multi-tenant thing, and it seems they are using Open vSwitch, and it seems to be so much magic there going on that, and so much magic numbers that I don't know how to start.
It's a lot of glue and string right now also. I mean, these scenarios are pretty new to Azure. And so I will say that, if we rewind to what I was talking about an application model for Azure where you have your long-running workloads, your short-running workloads, your websites, your VNets, your containers, your databases, and all this stuff, and you want it to kind of work all together. Clearly, this has to get solved, right? So that is definitely stuff that is going to get solved. The question then is it accessible without using that managed application platform kind of concept? And I don't know that that's known yet because we're still building it all. So stay tuned, I think, is the short one. Let's see. Okay, yeah. ASP.NET Core 3.0 generic host. This is true. So I think that there's a PR that's been opened against our ASP.NET Core integration. But I don't think we've pulled it in yet because as SF, we have to always worry about accidentally breaking the world. So what's likely to happen is that in the future, we're going to either have a separate package that specifically does things the generic host way, or over time, if the existing web host stuff does get just deprecated, then we will move as .NET Core moves. I think the thing today is that we don't have a good generic host example, or package that actually shows how to do it. So that's something that we should put together. In the meantime, you can look at the PR that's there to see what would need to change, and try it out and let us know, if there's other changes or things that you need. I think that that's probably the best way forward there. Microsoft hosted primary node pool. Yeah, something like that.
The PR is that it would be this project, right?
It should be in that project. I know it's there because I've had people point me to it. Maybe it's in a different repo. Maybe it's on the base one.
I'll look for it.
But I would just look for it. I think it was a guy named Ken or Keat. Anyway, you should see Amon there, who's kind of been shepherding the ASP.NET integration. So I would take a look. If you can't find it, let me know and I can try and track it down. But that is a proof of concept at a minimum that you could clone. Microsoft hosted primary node pool. Yeah, I did kind of bury that. So we want to take the system services out of your cluster and run them somewhere else so that you can do more scary, terrible things to your cluster, like scale it to 0 or delete the VM scale set without blowing up the entire environment. People want to do stuff like this. I get cold sweats when I think about doing some of these things, but it's come up enough that that's an option that we want to provide. It will also, you won't have to pay for a separate VM scale set specifically to run those system services. I don't know whether or not we will make you pay for the system services as a service. We're still kind of building it out and using it for ourselves because we have a huge number of clusters that we ourselves have to maintain for Microsoft and for Azure. So doing this helps us consolidate all of those brains generally in one place, right? And then we can manage that one environment very, very carefully and can care a little less and do a little bit more risky stuff with the actual clusters where all the workloads run.
Matt, there was a question a little further up that said, is there any plans to move SF project to the new SDK format and the possibility to .NET build a service fabric project?
I missed this one somehow. Apologies. There really is a plan to do that. However, the .NET team tells us that because of the way that service fabric projects are structured, they are actually blocked on a couple core language bugs or project system bugs in VS and .NET. So we are trying to figure out what those issues are and get them addressed hopefully sooner rather than later. Until then, we are told that moving them is infeasible because there will be performance issues. So they don't currently have a timeline for when they would fix those bugs and then be able to start the port. It's something that we're pressing on for these following semesters of work. Okay. Yeah, I would really like to be able to .NET pack this stuff too. It's madness to me that we still look like Service Fabric projects look like DNX projects, right? They look like pre.NET Core V1 stuff because that's when we were making them. That's when they started to exist. So we really got to bring them out of the past. And I will, if you wanted to send me hate mail or a request about this specifically, please do, and I will go, use that as a very polite baton for our friends over in .NET land and DevDiv to help figure out what we can do there. It's getting gross. It's starting to look old, and we know that. Anything on the roadmap for official support for Trafic or a Trafic-like alternative to App Gateway for service mesh routing? So there's a bunch of things here, right?
Unfortunately, that's just going to be my monthly theme for you.
Yeah, it's okay. So we're still working with we're working with Contaneous, actually, or however you say their name, to figure out how to do better support for SF in Trafic. They just went through a rewrite where they changed a lot of not just the 2.0, but another one where they changed kind of how all their plugin systems work. And we were waiting for that to finish and get the green light from them before we went back to figure out how to re-engage with their with them to try and build out better support and get the plugin modernized. Whether or not there's an official like supported story there, they seem interested in that. We seem interested in that, but we don't know how it's going to work strictly yet. Would it be supported by them or by us? So work is progressing, but I don't think I have a full story for you there. One thing I have to look up to see if it's been announced or discussed. So another thing that's popped up recently is, of course, more reverse proxies. So I've put a link to a project in the chat called YARP, which is, of course, yet another reverse proxy, which has been spun up by the ASP.NET folks and some .NET folks. They are also, kind of investigating whether or not they want to integrate or do some integration with SF. So that might be another route to a Microsoft-supported, open source thing. I don't think we know exactly what's going to happen here yet, but we are working on and talking about both of these, right? Certainly the work with Trafic is ongoing. I don't think we're going to take it in and run it as a first-party thing, but we are working with that team to figure out what they want to do. Okay, lightning round because are we running out of time? Do I know what time it is?
I was going to say, yeah, we've got about 3 minutes. Let's make this our last question. I think there's a question about Envoy.
I usually try and run through them as quickly as possible, and then people can send me mail later if I didn't actually do a good job. I don't see the thing about Envoy just yet, but
so
Envoy,
what happened to Envoy? Is it dead?
It's not dead. The Microsoft started a port of it to Windows, and then it kind of got dropped by the community, and I haven't seen a lot of progress there since. So at times we've thought about rebuilding the existing reverse proxy. Now we're thinking more about bringing in something like YARP or Trafic or something like that. So I don't know a full answer yet, unfortunately, about how it's going to land. Turns out there's just too many reverse proxies out there. With my Microsoft hosted primary node pool, am I sacrificing failure detection? No, that absolutely has to keep working. Happy to pay for system services, just not paying as much. Yeah, I mean, the whole idea behind us running them is we dearly hope that we can run them more efficiently than you would have to run them in your own environments. So that's something that we're going to see what happens. I honestly don't know what we will do. We might keep them free. We might, charge a small amount. We might charge amounts based on some sort of reliability or performance tiers. I don't think we know. We've addressed Envoy, YARP, good. What's the status on refreshing the source with the latest bits? Yeah, so the more we dig into that, the more we find that the open sourcing of stuff was basically like a script under somebody's desk, and that's not cool. So we have to really modernize our engineering systems in order to make this more sustainable. We are starting to get to a point where that's going to be feasible. I'm hoping that in the meantime we can start doing just raw dumps again, but there is a commitment from the team to do better here. I don't have a time frame for when we would catch up, but we do want to. And that's time. Haha. All right.
Thank you, everyone. I just posted in the chat, so I'll have the recording today in Yammer as soon as it's available to me on stream. And thank you, everyone, for the thoughtful questions and the engaging conversation. And Matt, your knowledge is amazing, and your ability to answer these so quickly is also amazing.
I tell people it's not that I'm terribly smart. I just have a 10-year head start on everybody. So.
That's right. Awesome. Thanks, everyone, for your time today. And we'll see you next month. Take care.
Thanks, everyone. Be well. Bye-bye.